aspects of the democratization process in Slovenia in terms of comparing it to other communist states in the last 25 years. One is civil society and the other one is transitional justice. The question I ask, or the puzzle that I see important in this regard, goes together with the panel theme, which is the quality of democracy, and these two aspects, civil society and transitional justice, have taken large part in post or transitional societies in East Central Europe and former Soviet Union. Because these two, civil society and transitional justice, are indicative of the quality of life of citizens and also of the quality of democracy. And especially in post-communist countries, these two have influenced the question of political transition and societal transition. Political regime has changed, and so have societies. To what extent, and to what extent these two areas, civil society and transitional justice, are important. And here's the question. From a comparative perspective, if we look at different countries of East Central Europe in the post-communist world, looking at Slovenia, we see that it scores relatively high in democracy. And Dr. Miro Hacek will be able to give you a quite detailed explanation how to measure democracy and how it is done. But having those relatively high scores, the question that I have for today is, why has Slovenia lagged behind in the development of the civil society sector? So if democracy is fine, and we know that civil society is a school of democracy, is named by Alexis de Tocqueville, why then the civil society is not as developed, or to the extent that, let's say, the general level of democracy is as measured by different indices? And the question is, why has Slovenia lagged behind in terms of developing or implementing different mechanisms of transitional justice? If we live in a flourishing democracy, what's then wrong with transitional justice? And here's the context. Of course, we live in a beautiful country, right? You just read the New York Times and you will see this quote, "Visiting Ljubljana, Slovenia's 1,000-year-old capital feels like stepping into an ancient fable." Of course, a fairy tale, wonderful, right? And we like it. Slovenia is recognized, it gets recognition such as a green country. We have green Ljubljana, it's everything is sustainable, wonderful. The green heart of Europe. We have a lot of Erasmus students on exchange here, many working and well-working EU institutions, groups such as LGBTI are strong here. The civil society seems to be in place. Yet, often now they talk about the unease in living, firstly, in the European Union. People talk about you're not living happily ever after, the wedding, of course, but unhappily. We have the questions of Brexit, there's the Greek problem, EU unpopularity, then we have this discussion, what is right and wrong between the polarization, the United States and Russia, and we know that the majority of, or let's say the main part of the Slovenian public opinion would favor Russian policies against the US policies, even though the educational sector, economic sector would tend or prefer the Western counterpart. And we have quite some post-communist blues in Slovenia. This term was coined in the early 90s when people would discover that even though regime would have or has changed, legacies of the communist regime have remained, and also nostalgia. Cronyism, which then affects, of course, corruption. And then we go to the media, and what we hear in the last days is that Slovenia transfers mass grave remains of Nazi collaborators. There's a misspelling, it was spelled so in the Israeli Times. So is this wonderful Slovenia to see coffins on the front page? How beautiful is that? Every day we have discussions about how many people were killed during or after the war. And where is the reconciliation process right now? And who do you vote for? Do you vote for the former communists or the anti-communists? Are you on the right or on the left? So where is the fairy tale there? thousands of people dead, buried after, let's have some quotes. Ferenc says, you probably know him, civilians who had collaborated or were thought to have collaborated, so this is a better specification than in the title, with the Nazis and then executed often without trial, immediately after the Second World War. Ferenc also said that Wartime Mass Graves Commission has registered some 700 possible mass grave sites in which some 15,000 people are believed to be buried. And these numbers, of course, vary to the extent of the knowledge of a particular scientist or expert. Pahor, the President of the Republic of Slovenia, also had a statement such as, reconciliation is possible only once we are ready to forgive and to admit the truth even if it's painful, hard and incriminating. It's almost like hearing a priest talk. It is very interesting in Slovenia to see that the language of reconciliation has been taken over by a so-called political left. While in the 90s and early 2000s, the political right has vocally advocated for the process of reconciliation with the various mechanisms. Now it seems that the President has taken over. Quite a few years ago, he started to advocate strongly for reconciliation. So where are we at now? And why is this happening in Slovenia 25 years later? We have another member of the current political opposition, Janša, former Prime Minister, who said a few weeks ago, reconciliation not possible without truth. So basically he agrees with Pahor, or probably Pahor agrees with Janša, if we may say so, right? I'm being a bit provocative here. So civil society, what I find in my research with my colleagues is that the development of voluntary association has been characterized by, there has been some relative growth, and we'll see that in numbers shortly, and we can distinguish in terms of the historical perspective. One is prior to the Second World War, and then the prohibition during the Nazi regime and the communist regime, and then we get some mixed results. And we'll see that the survey data is that we find the civil sector growing and developing, sometimes even faster than in some other post-communist states. Yet we are lagging, if we may say Slovenia. Slovenia is lagging behind the countries of Western Europe or Northern Europe or so. But we also see that a large part of the civic sector is acting in ways that prevent civil society from having an overall positive impact on the society as a whole. And the reasons we find is that the civil society has frequent links to post-communist ideology or political group. We also find that civil society tends to follow Gramsci's understanding of the civic sector as an area of social cultural hegemony. I know there's a lot of philosophy behind it. And also that there is weak support from the part of the citizenry and expectations from them in terms of what civil society can do or does. So some of the tables there just to show you that Slovenia in many of these areas such as sports and recreation, trade unions, by these we measure the success of the civil society, more or less. Is scoring pretty high comparing to, let's say, countries in Eastern Europe or even compared to Central Europe, if those countries of Central Europe are understood as post-communist countries. Yet it lags behind the regions such as Scandinavia, Western Europe, Germany and so on. In some areas, pretty strong actually, if we look at the post-communist world only. But here's the main question. What do you compare yourself to? Right? A few more areas there, youth work. Where Slovenia scores very low is being involved in projects of third world development, peace movements, and so on. It has lost huge membership in terms of trade union participation or membership. Also, membership in political parties used to be among the highest in Europe actually, but that has fallen tremendously in the last few years. So Slovenia now scores as the country whose decline participation in political party as such. This is a finding that our colleagues Matej Cepin and others have come across, is that there's also a difference between what we perceive as civil society activity and what is reported as civil society activity. And what is interesting, if you take a look at this difference in ranks, is that so perceived activity is very high, let's say, for women's rights, but actually it's much lower. Or perceived activity for, let's say, LGBT rights is much higher than actual one. So the higher the difference, or let's say consumer protection, we tend to think that protection is higher, that the civil society organizations do great work in those areas, but actually are not, or are to a lesser extent. So what influences the development of Slovenia's civil society, or has influenced its development, is of course history, very important. Legacies cannot be just put away with. Then there's different perceptions. Often the public, in a large measure, thinks of the civil society as an unnecessary element. Also, it's considered as a weak, or the weakest partner by the part of the state. And the civil society as such is internally divided. It doesn't have sufficient funding, they would say. They have poor management, and they're not equally treated by the state, especially if they're linked to a particular political background or ideology. And that makes a huge difference in terms of funding as well. So have the dreams that were there at the beginning or before the democratization process come true. Advocacy is another issue that is extremely important, but not functioning to the extent it could, especially if we compare ourselves to other countries in Europe. And so does this mean we live in a flourishing democratic society? How about the justice question? You have heard of different mechanisms that can be implemented in terms of justice after regime change, during transition. I will just name a few. I'll go through here very quickly. So there are quite a few important questions that arise after regime change. What and whose justice? What is justice and who does it? And then what does it mean transitional? Because we know that justice as such cannot be transitional, but we know that justice needs to be done in a different manner during regime change than during the transition period, as it's usually done in a country that already functions as a well-developed democracy. And what are these mechanisms? We go to Rwanda, to the Gacaca courts, famous Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, Truth Commissions in Morocco, lustration or denazification or decommunization or debathification. So the entire former party or a party is banned from politics or even administration and so forth. You open the archives, picture from Poland, memorialization, where they put a different memorial is extremely important. Who stays, who's not? Do we leave Tito or not? And Kidrič is still there. How about the dissidents that worked for democracy and so on? Important questions. Who does it? Who pays for it? Where do we place them? Those that are removed, where do we put them? Mediation is another process that is possible. Property restitution, victim compensation. Some of that has been done in Slovenia, but not as much. Apology. The regime can say they are sorry for what their predecessors have said. You amnesty, so entire population or armies are amnestied, or there is absence. In a large part, Slovenia has experienced absence. And the question is, why is that the case? For example, why there has been nobody charged in a criminal way for the mass murders committed after the Second World War? It's a huge question. So we have seen the photo with the president and the coffin and the minister and many other dignitaries, and nobody's responsible. How is that? You tell me. We will focus on illustration here in terms of transitional justice because we have a second panel where colleague Tomasz Zau will talk about transitional justice as well. And this is just to show you the extent to which certain countries have dealt with the communist past in terms of illustration. So this is a photo from former East Germany. You know the saying, you better come to us, otherwise we come to you. It was the saying of the old Stasi police. Or you go to the Czech Republic where the Prague Spring event was extremely important and then influenced on the acceptance of the illustration legislation, also archives in Poland. There were 50 15 states, 15 post-communist states that have accepted some sort of or type of lustration. And then you go to Slovenia, you see the photo of mass graves in Kutayama, or you go to Russia, the two people there have the same image. Yeltsin actually did try, or was approached by Galina Starovoitova, who was later murdered in 98 in Russia, where I did some research, but never adopted lustration. So 19 post-communist states, if we consider the total of 34, have not had any lustration, even though some of them debated it. And Slovenian Transitional Justice. So we go just briefly through history. We know that in the mid-40s and early 50s, communist repression was extremely harsh, much more than in other countries. But then from 60s to the 80s, we could call this a softer approach if we compare it to other communist countries at the time. And then with 91, there was independence and quick democratization. The scores rose very quickly in terms of levels of democracy. There was an attempted lustration law in 97 that was rejected in the parliament right here. And there is total absence of criminal or political prosecution by the former president. It was rated as a second-class topic. And then there has been some property restitution, some recommendation that should be recompensation for the victims. I have met quite a few in the United States who have fled Slovenia as refugees and were given some recompensation. So here's the puzzle. Why do some post-communist states limit political participation of former authoritarian elites or secret collaborators, or those who work with secret collaborators, for example, offering them a flat from which they would eavesdrop to, let's say, people that were thought to be against the regime, and others did not? Why is this happening if we all lived in a communist regime? And then also, why has lustration become the region's defining transitional justice mechanism? It's very widespread. Not Slovenia. Slovenia is a bit of an exception here, but why the region has talked so much about this? We will just define very briefly lustration, that it limits political participation of former authoritarian elites. It just says, because you are a member of the Communist Party, let's say top level, you cannot be the prime minister, or you cannot be in the parliament. Depends on the country. Each country has a different approach. It's some sort of a vetting process, and it's basically concerns the job or work position. You can still be, let's say, a manager in a company or work elsewhere, but in some countries you cannot even be a priest, for example, or work in state media or so. It depends. Each country has a different approach to illustration. So this is what you find when you start classifying cases. We see that quite a few countries have done it. We can talk about one case of lustration in Slovenia, which actually cannot happen as such. There was a judge who was considered as collaborating with the former communist regime in certain trials, and he was considered as someone who would not get the job according to a legislative provision of a law from 1994, and then the committee decided not to implement that article, just to wait one more year so he would be, I will skip the name, he would be age 70 and would no longer be eligible. So and they actually didn't do illustration, they did it backwards. Here's the Czech example. So people would apply for a specific job. They have two illustration laws that are still in place. They're actually now in perpetuity. And let's say you would have this by month. This is public data. You can access it, and you would go. You would see how many people applied for a certain position in the government or elsewhere that falls under this legislative provision. So let's say in January of this is 2013, 182 people applied. Most of them are negative, meaning they were not found in the files as collaborating with the former regime to the extent that is provided or envisioned by the law, but 3 of them were. So those 3 guys cannot apply for that position. That's one law. They have another law which is less relevant but still important. So at the end you would see that a year 37 people were banned from working at specific levels of government. Similar processes are in place in Germany, in also Romania, Bulgaria, some other countries, including now Ukraine from 2014. And And there are some theories, since we are also political scientists here, that could explain why illustration takes place in some countries and not in others. And I will skip these. They're very important. I'll just give you the findings. Some of them are macrostructural that relate to the past. For example, were they members of the Warsaw Pact? Was the communist repression harsh? Or they come from the present, so what's the level of democracy? What's the proximity to elections? Because certain things may happen just before the election. Actually, it also happened here in Slovenia before the presidential election. That's why we had the attempted illustration law in 1997. There are a few other factors, and there are some voluntarist factors too. It could just belong, depend on the leader's personality, such as Yeltsin. Yeltsin had in front of him on his desk the illustration law draft, and he said he could actually implement it through an executive decision, which then he did not. There's actually an interesting event, but maybe later about that, what Yeltsin did. So what we find is that democratic competition has huge influence on accepting illustration, but then also illustration often gets used, or sometimes even abused for political purposes. Now, we have looked at illustration as a consequence. So we have different factors that have an impact on the fact whether a country has illustration or not. But now, since I have done this variable describing illustration in all these different countries, let's see if this impacts other political phenomena, such as democracy. And I took a look at corruption, and people don't like this finding. I'm not saying I'm for illustration or against it. It's just data, right? And just a few models. And here's what we find. Is that if this is statistics, it basically says when you have a star there, it has a statistical significance. The more stars, the more significant. And also it depends a little bit on the coefficient you see there. You see that across all models and across different indices of corruption, and Rožič is an expert on corruption too, he can tell you more about these indices. You can see across these models, and you can include many other variables. People tell me, oh, you have to include this. You're wrong. People tell me, you're wrong. There's something wrong with your model. So I offer them 6 models, or 2, 3, 5 pages of models, and everywhere illustration has an impact. Now the coefficient is not that high, but you see, so this is not probability. We're talking about probability, not it's not the determination. So the likelihood of corruption being lower or getting lower is higher in countries that have implemented some level of illustration, or even when there has been a discussion of illustration. Because if you have a country that hasn't had illustration, such as Slovenia, it's much different than a country such as Kazakhstan, which has not even discussed illustration. So there are big differences also within the area of negative cases. But when we have this scale, you can see it here. I rank illustration from 0 to 7, and 4 would be adopted by a parliament, but not yet implemented. For example, the Serbs had an illustration law that was adopted by the parliament but never went into force. You know, there was a saying in Yugoslavia, Serbs write the law, Croats read them, and Slovenians implement them. Well, Serbs never implemented it, but still it had certain impact. And we see that corruption, now I inverted this, corruption gets lower, especially when you debate it a lot, and then the more you implement it, even more. And here's another, we call this quadratic prediction. So this is just stats. So what does this tell us about the quality of democracy? The way we measure democracy, or the ways we measure democracies are various. But they kind of coincide, and there is some agreement upon how to measure this. And does civil society and transitional justice tell us a little bit about the quality of democracy? I'll leave that up to you or to our discussion. Thank you very much.